Hi, everybody. Welcome back. Michael Gurian here. So honored to introduce Dr. Christina Hoff Sommers. We've known each other for quite a long time, and just so much respect for her work. So, I was first made aware of her work even before the War Against Boys, which came out, I believe, in 2000. And then the War Against Boys came out in 2000. It's just a seminal work. And then, over the years and more lately, a book that really influenced me, Freedom Feminism, and the concept of freedom feminism. So Dr. Sommers is a philosopher, and she is going to tell us obviously more about herself, and then also get into what's going on with schools and how we can advocate, and why is it so hard to advocate for boys. So take it away, Christina.
I'm so happy to be part of this summit, and I want to thank the Santa Fe Boys Fund and the Gurian Foundation for organizing this event. I'm delighted to be part of it. When my book came out in 2000, The War Against Boys, not too many people were aware of how far behind boys had fallen. Almost nobody was talking about the boy gap in education. And today, thankfully, that has changed. There's widespread knowledge of the struggles boys are having, both in school, socially, vocationally. Multiple books, articles, studies, documentaries are highlighting their needs. So we know a lot about what works for boys and how to help them thrive. But implementing that knowledge in our classrooms remains a problem. And although many educators recognize that boys have fallen behind girls in most of the ways that count, in school engagement, in grades, in being, going to college, most importantly, um, they're not yet, we haven't yet seen school systems, uh, classrooms, schools of education sort of implement these programs in any concrete way. And this it's very different in other countries that also are having serious troubles with boys. If you look at Great Britain and Australia, Canada, their boys are struggling and have similar gaps as American boys. But the difference is amazing in the way that they've spent the past 20 or 25 years when they became aware of it. As soon as they became aware of it, they began to make massive efforts, publicly funded efforts to boost boys' achievement. And you just don't see anything like that in the United States. It's beginning to change a little bit, but even today, efforts to help boys are likely to be met with skepticism, sometimes, as I will show, even hostility. Now, to understand why this is, I think it's useful to travel back in time about 35, almost 40 years ago, uh, and consider what was going on that moment when a researcher named Thomas Mortensen uh, was working in a Washington institute, and he may have been the first person to notice that something was seriously amiss with boys. Now, Tom is a mild-mannered, just the facts, ma'am, sort of social scientist from Iowa. He's a senior scholar at the Pell Institute for the Study of Opportunity in Higher Education. And the Pell, it's a philanthropic group, which, as its name implies, looks for ways to improve educational prospects for disadvantaged girls. And it does studies and policy analyses. And part of Mortensen's job was to look at the data and identify trends. So in the 80s, he was looking and he noticed that, wow, by 1982, the gap in college attendance, which once very much favored boys, it had closed. Girls had caught up. And he was quite happy about that. As not only as a researcher for equal opportunity, but as he will say, he's now in his 80s, but he would say he had a daughter and granddaughters. He was very happy. But as the years went by, the next year came the 90s, 91, 92. He was noticing that the gap was getting larger with every passing year. The girls not only had closed the gap with boys, but they had now opened it and they were far ahead. I would say by 92, 93, he was alarmed. And you can understand it's at one point he was looking at these trends and he said, half jokingly, but the last male is going to graduate college in 2068, and we have to turn things around. We have to do something. He was certain that other statisticians, journalists, educators, political leaders were seeing what he was seeing, and he waited for a response. That response never came. he he was alone. And finally, by 95, he thought, well, I'll have to write something and I'll get it going. He wrote a little piece, which I happened to see, was called What's Wrong with Guys? And the thing is that by 1995, it was clear that things had changed just in terms of a young person's prospects in the workplace, that education became beyond high school had become essential to almost for everyone to get into the middle class. There had been a time where a young person could graduate from high school, get a job, and raise a family. By the 90s, that was over. You needed to have education beyond high school. There was nothing more valuable than a 4-year degree, but even associate's degree was better. But in all those areas, he saw that the boys, their trajectory had just kind of flattened out and the girls were soaring ahead. And he so he published this, and again, it was met with silence. His warnings just fell on deaf ears. Now, I think the reason this happened, I mean, I think he would agree, is that he was sounding that alarm at the very moment that the media and educators and the government were focused on the plight of girls. Throughout the 1990s, groups like the National Women's Law Center and the American Association of University Women, they had done some highly publicized studies, uh, which showing, they said, that girls were shortchanged, not only shortchanged, but demoralized in the nation's schools. And there was a massive and very successful campaign to strengthen girls. And in 1993, Congress was moved to pass the Gender Equity and Education Act. And it categorized girls as an underserved population on a par with other discriminated against groups. And there were also best-selling books like Reviving Ophelia, Failing at Fairness, alerting parents to the troubles that faced by their daughters. Hundreds and millions of dollars of grants were awarded to address the educational needs of girls. And the Ms. Foundation mobilized Take Your Daughter to Work Day. The Department of Health and Human Services launched a girl power movement. It even got to the point that the United Nations had at their fourth World Conference on Women in Beijing, members of the American delegation presented the educational and psychological fragility of American girls as a pressing human rights issue. Now, again, Mortenson was looking, he knew all this. He supported a lot of it because he cared about girls as much as boys. But what he saw happening to boys scared him. He saw there would be serious consequences for the economy, for families, for the millions of young men himself. And he he was at a loss as to what to do. Now, the thing is, when Congress passed this act, it mandated that the Department of Education, its statisticians, carry out a very careful study. It mandated a careful study on gender equity in the schools. And the women's groups eagerly waited the results because they were certain that they would finally have hardcore, unimpeachable evidence of a gap favoring boys. They wanted that to use to continue this girl campaign. Now, the short-changed girl, as they called it, the short-changed girl crisis, had a lot. It was based on a lot of unconventional evidence. There was sort of dubious self-esteem studies and sort of reports with a lot of metaphor-laden language about climates and voices and so forth. A lot of it came from the work of Carol Gilligan. But they knew they needed something stronger than that. So this was it. The DOE's study, the Department of Education study, that was going to seal the deal. Well, they did the study and it came out in 2000. Things didn't go as planned. As I said, this was not based on metaphorical voices and climate. This was hardcore, straightforward criteria. They looked at grades, test scores, school engagement, honors program, college attendance, numbers. And by those standards, they said themselves that girls were doing far better than boys. They looked at about 44 uh, indicators of academic strength and failure. And on about half of the indicators, boys and girls were the same. On two or three, boys were stronger. They on standardized tests, they scored a little higher in math and science. That it was the gap was small and it was getting smaller all the time. But overall, girls turned out by far and away to be the superior students. And according to the report, and I quote, there is evidence that the female advantage in school performance is real and persistent. And I actually called up the gentleman at the Department of Education, Thomas Snyder, who had sponsored the study, and talked to him. And he said, we just didn't realize that girls were doing that well. And just to give you a few findings, female high school seniors have higher educational aspirations. They are more ambitious than their male peers. Female students are more likely to take advanced placement classes and exams. They are consistently outperforming males in reading and writing. This sentence jumped out at me in the study. Differences in male and female writing achievements are large, with male 11th graders scoring at about the same level as female 8th graders. So imagine, you've got an 11th grade boy who's writing like an 8th grade girl. This is a problem. And of course, they found females are more likely to go to college. Now, what impact do you think this study had? Trends in equity in education. This was what they'd all been waiting for. It finally came out, 2000, and it shows not what people expected. Now, you might have thought that some of the women's groups would have gone back to the drawing board and looked for ways to address the needs of girls in math and science, but acknowledge the vulnerabilities of boys. That is not what happened. Uh, they were silent about the boys, and the Department of Education itself was not that comfortable with its own findings. I spoke to someone there who told me that there were people in the department who worried that it would undermine programs for women and girls. So how did the truth about boys finally break through? Well, reality has a way of getting noticed. Teachers themselves observed what was happening with their young men, and they saw the fecklessness and disengagement with their own eyes day after day. Parents were noticing. They'd go to graduation and who was winning the honors, who was the valedictorian. It was by and large girls. Well, young men were being given most of the prescriptions for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Now, college admissions officers were also watching and seeing what Mortensen had seen. And it's like him, at first they were a little confused, baffled, and then panicked. And a new phrase entered the admissions office lexicon, which is the tipping point. That's the point at which the ratio of men to women reaches 60-40. And at that point, girls don't want to go to the school. It's not that the boys defect. They don't mind being, in the minority at a college with, overwhelming number of women, but the girls don't like it. So the college admissions officers were very worried. And I will tell you, by 2000 or so, they were already near the tipping point, and many have gone past it by now, especially the big state universities, University of North Carolina, University of Michigan, as well as Brandeis, NYU, the private universities, American University. They were all at the tipping point or beyond now. And they actually feared that their campuses would become like retirement villages where you would have, a surfeit of women competing for, uh, a handful of surviving men. So it wasn't because of this Department of Education studies. It was just that, and then individual scholars, me, I wrote the book on boys in 2000, and a lot of us were out there. There were other books. I mean, Leonard Sachs was there, and Michael and others. We were individual authors were there. There were many books that followed, many magazine articles. My book was excerpted in Atlantic. It was on the cover. Um, but the women's groups were not happy with this development. They saw this as part of a backlash against girls, and op-eds began to appear in major newspapers denying that there was a problem. Two researchers at the Brandeis Women's Studies Research Center wrote a piece in the Washington Post, which they later turned into a book called The Myth of the Boy Crisis. And they said that, quote, the fact that girls are succeeding academically touches a wellspring of psychic fear in people. And just attributing very bad motives to the those who were defending and pointing out the needs of boys. And then it was 2008, the AAUW issued a 103-page study refuting the idea that boys were disadvantaged at all. It's called Where the Girls Are, The Facts About Gender Equity and Education. They claimed that the boy crisis was a hoax. It was a manufactured crisis. They flatly denied that boys were in any kind of trouble. In fact, they said they're doing better than ever. Today's young men, they said, are graduating at record numbers. More men are earning college degrees in the United States than any time in history. Men are not falling behind. It's simply that females have made more rapid gains. Now, this was kind of statistical sleight of hand. Technically, it was true that there were more, just in terms of absolute numbers, more boys attending college every year. But the population, that you have to take into account the growth in population. And this other thing you have to take account is what Morton's had pointed out, is that it was much, your prospects were far worse in the 90s, in the late 80s, 90s, 2000s by not going to college compared to what it meant many years before. Even in Mortenson's pamphlet, what's happened to the guys, he said there's just so much more opportunity now. There's so much more to gain, and the young women are keeping up, and the men aren't. So what happened is it's true they went up a little bit, but it was pretty flat, and the girls had taken off. And as one New York Times writer eventually would write, leaving men in the dust. So they sort of covered it up. Their real complaint was, I think, that is one person said to me when we were together on a program sort of debating. She said, well, maybe boys are doing better in school, but they're still winning in life. And the AAUW in that survey had pointed out the wage gap and suggested that this was just part of a backlash, they just really weren't able to take seriously the idea that boys could have a problem because of the struggles that women were having in the workplace. Now, I'm not going to spend time to dispute the wage gap, but I will say that I think it's a problem with the contemporary women's movement that it tends to look at the pinnacle of success. It looks at the Fortune 500, how many CEOs of the Fortune 500, or how many senators, or how many PhDs in physics at MIT, sort of saying the pinnacle of success. And I agree with them. As a feminist, I want women to improve those numbers, but that's the pinnacle of success. You have to look at the whole picture. And too often, as feminists, we just looked at the higher end, and we saw a lack of equality, not noticing the struggles of men who were not, CEOs of Fortune 500s, which is millions of men. The the problem is, though, this this report they gave out in 2008 disparaging the boys movement was got a lot of attention. It was in, it treated very respectfully in all the major news outlets. By contrast, the highly partisan, um, I mean the more objective trends in equity in education got no publicity. This study was everywhere, and the AAUW was very excited. They said, the AAUW, we've captured the media attention. This demonstrates our power and our credibility. We captured it, and they thought that that was equivalent of legitimacy. But capturing media attention and being credible are distinct phenomena. And what it demonstrates to me is that these women's groups were just had a preternatural ability to lobby and to network and sometimes to spin. And the AAUW, after they did this study, just trying to discredit the boys' cause, they said, build the buzz for girls and circulate our study. And they told this to 100,000 of their members in their on their blog. And I realized at that time that, there's no buzz machine for behind the research on boys. Men like Thompson and the no nonsense statisticians at the Department of Education, Tom Snyder, that very legitimate study, it was just no match for these groups, these activist groups. And I don't think these girl groups had bad motives. I think they truly believed it. And they just weren't able, they just were not somehow capable of believing that men could have, and young men and boys, uh, they couldn't take it seriously. Now, I tell this story, I review this history because I think it helps explain why even today the U.S. is kind of, our schools of education are kind of resistant to addressing the boy gap, because the girl lobby was hugely successful in mobilizing this national effort to address the math and science gap that favored boys. But I do fault them for making it nearly impossible to implement programs to address all the areas where boys were behind. And, to address the gaps in reading and writing, in ambition, in engagement, in college attendance. And to this day, anybody who writes about efforts for boys will bear the stigma of backlash. Efforts to help boys, um, you you will, even like Richard Reeves it came out recently with a very good book of Boys and Men. And right away, a columnist in the New York Times, Jessica Gross, called the boy crisis a myth which persists because there's always a market for anti-feminist backlash. And she included Richard in that piece. Um, Scott Galloway at NYU has an excellent and important new book on the plight of boys and young men, Notes on Being a Man. And as soon as it was published, the New Yorker was ready with a hit piece by a writer, Jessica Winter. And she kind of implied that Galloway, as well as other politically liberal men, she said there was this manosphere and it was right wing, but now there was a left wing manosphere. And she kind of put anybody that advocates for boys in this left-wing manosphere, and that included Richard Reeves. In fact, she referred to Reeves' book, his very judicious and careful and methodical book. She referred to it as a Jeremiad or a screed or something. I don't get that. And then she went after Gavin Newsom and Rahm Emanuel as part of she implied this kind of a cynical cabal to degrade women. So this buzz machine, it never sleeps. It is always with us. And as I said earlier, young men in Great Britain, Australia, Canada, who have fallen behind, they have been energetically looking for solutions. They experiment with all sorts of things, all boys schools, recruiting more male teachers, changing, finding male friendly pedagogy. European countries in general have superb vocation programs, vocational schools and apprenticeships that are wonderful for boys and preparing them for the workplace. We have a large cohort of young men, all races, who are not going to find a place for themselves in a knowledge economy, an information-based economy. And economists increasingly are saying that this cohort has been just they will not be part of the economy. We have large numbers of men who have not only unemployed, they're not looking for work. And some economists, labor economists, have warned that by the middle of this century, about a third, if things don't change, a third of the male workforce it will be missing. In the prime working age, like 18 to 55. They so the Europeans look at this, and especially the British, and they view it as a threat to national security. And they see that male literacy and that they've got to find a way to close the gap. The British Parliament went so far as to create a reading list of books that boys find irresistible and send it to teachers across the country. It's just hard to imagine anything quite like that happening here. Now, the education writer some years ago, Richard Whitmer, and a literacy expert, William Bronzo, explained the stakes. They said, in rather dire terms, but I think I agree with them. They said the global economic race we read so much about, the marathon to produce the most educated workforce and therefore the most prosperous nation, really comes down to a calculation. Whichever nation solves these boy troubles will win the race. Well, the United States has an extra handicap because we're not only coping with millions of poorly educated boys and young men, but with a tenacious women's lobby that thwarts efforts to help them. So, boys and young men are now the have-nots in education. And from the earliest grades, our schools do a better job of educating girls. And as I said, we know a lot about how to make boys thrive. There have been many, many studies. We've documented there's actually grading bias against girls. It's something that teachers could learn about in schools of education and try to correct for. We know that the importance for all children to have recess and free play, but especially importance for boys. And this has been brilliantly documented by people like Anthony Pellegrini at the University of Minnesota, who's an expert on play. And just a disparate impact. We need that, I don't want to say that we want to have a buzz like the women's groups do, where you sort of promote sometimes dubious claims about male deficits, but just it's so good that we're beginning to have meetings like this, and more groups are developing, more institutes, more commissions, all those things that in the New Yorker were part of so-called this left-wing manosphere. I see this as a very good sign, and I hope to see more of it, because the health and education and welfare of young men is a pressing public issue. And men and women are not on separate teams competing for a single trophy. It's not a zero-sum competition. We're in this together, and the rise of women, however long overdue, does not require the fall of men. Thank you.
Mm. Thank you, Christina. You said it very well. And listening to you, I was sort of chuckling. I was remembering back in the day, Wonder Boys came out. I was the guy getting attacked, and then Michael, Thompson Raising Cain, and you get
Michael
War Against
Thompson.
Boys,
Oh, yes.
and then you put out War Against Boys, you're getting attacked, and on and on it went, and it's I'm so glad you've explained the phenomenon and the history. Let me ask you about schools of education. I, I I think you and I have talked before about what a profound gap that is, that schools of education don't teach, and schools of psychology don't teach new teachers and new counselors that males and females are different, or just that now me, I take more of a brain-based perspective, but just boys and girls are different, and we need to educate them pedagogically and include some differences. At, like, are we seeing any gains there in schools of education in teaching that?
It's hard to know what goes on, but they are pretty much captive to critical theory and intersectionality. And boys just, don't, are not, they're more seen as oppressors. I mean, they tend to view Americans, still view it as a patriarchal, oppressive society, and take the view that was, uh, that I found in 2008 in that AAUW study, that why, if there's a wage gap, that boys are still, why are we going to worry about boys if they're going to be so successful later on? And they just don't have not processed it as a problem. By the way, I remember when your book came out, I don't know what year this was. I went to see you at a talk at Harvard University. Do you know what year that was?
Yeah, I spoke at Harvard in the School of Ed sort of every year from like 2000, I'm sorry, from 1997 to about 2002. And then I just got attacked so much I stopped. What
Because
year?
I was astonished. I loved your book, and I guess it had come out, and I went to see you, and you were speaking, just you were uninhibitedly about male and female differences, and I thought you got a pretty good response in that room. Maybe they were just being polite, but it was the first time I thought, oh, you're allowed to say these things. And you did it so in a very charming way. You were very effective, but it had a big influence on me. And then I started looking into male-female differences because I did think that was probably the key to developing a male pedagogy is, what worries me today is that when you talked about psychologists and schools of education, what worries me is that when there's certain groups, they will admit there's a problem with boys, but with girls, it was like, how do we change the classroom to make them more hospitable to girls? With boys, it's how do we change the boys? And they tend to diagnose a toxic masculinity or something, or they're captive to a boy code, and they will allow interventions that try to, liberate them from standard, masculine traits, rather than, you know, finding techniques that meet them where they are. And that worries me
Yeah.
that approach that came out when I guess it was the Association of American Psychologists created this report. Some of their recommendations were good, but overall they were very much captive to a sort of gender ideology about uh, toxic masculinity. I think that's not helpful.
Yeah, yeah, it makes sense. Okay, talk about that a little because in a way, isn't is the toxic masculinity thing that we've all been trying to push back on the last like 5 years or so since the American Psychological Association guidelines. Yeah, what those are for folks is those guidelines were put out, and what they basically said is the job of the therapist is to remove from men their misogyny and their toxicity, right? And all of that. So it was,
Their and teach them about their privilege. And imagine, I think about that in the classroom, or heaven forbid, some depressed boy who goes to a therapist who would talk to him about his privilege. I mean, I pray that's not going on, but I fear that it is. And they're just,
yeah,
in Australia, their psychologists are realize they weren't reaching boys and men, and they've tried to develop a male specific techniques. And it turns out the best approach is like teach the young man about it. All right, you've got this. It's a problem. Let's engage his inner problem solver. We're just going to approach it. And they also have an app because boys are more likely to go on an app than to actually want to talk to, directly to somebody. They're doing everything. And when I read that psychology report, I thought they're just going to miss out on that, because they're not seeing that you have to meet them where they are and not begin with the assumption that they're they're defective as human beings because of their masculinity.
Yeah, isn't that such an important thing for everyone to hear? What you pointed out that when we try to help girls, we try to change the system to help girls. When we see there's a problem for boys in a system, we just figure the boy is defective. I mean
Yeah.
that's kind of what you're saying, right?
Yeah, I sometimes when I give talks about boys, I tell a story of my son many years ago when he was a senior. He graduated high school and they went on a group trip to the desert. And he came home and said there's one thing he didn't like very much is that a creative writing teacher had come to the camp and they had some exercise to stimulate their imagination. And she gave them all a pad of paper and pencils and a candle and matches. And they were told to disperse a little into the desert and to sit down and discover themselves. And what happened was the girls followed the assignment and they wrote all sorts of sensitive things and came back and shared it with the group. The boys were completely bewildered by this assignment. They gathered together in a little group, threw the notebooks into a pile, and made a bonfire. Now, the teacher, I understandably, this was summer camp, so, and these were nice boys. These are not juvenile delinquents, but the teacher thought they were, like that was an example of toxic masculinity, and it was camp. It was they didn't, asking them to write that to be as I think Ralph Fletcher says the confessional poet. So many writing assignments in a classroom are really cater to girls' strengths and interests. And that these boys didn't want to write about that. There were so many things that could have been done that uh, I always take that as a kind of example of what's gone wrong with so much pedagogy. Now, it's not that there aren't girls who are bonfire builders and boys who are sensitive poets, but I think every class, every teacher should know that there are just different methodologies. And so the girls that defy the stereotype will benefit, as will the boys. So if teachers just know that you're more likely to get a boy to read a book, or if you ask him to write a story, it might be about a monster destroying a city. And just to accept that that's the way the youthful young male, male imagination works. But instead, boys are often punished. We've got some good studies about how often teachers interfere even with little boys, even when they're playing. A lot of little boys engage in superhero play, and there's good guys and bad guys that have to be vanquished. And two researchers in the University of Maine found that when girls play, teachers intervene and change far less. With boys, there's constant redirection, and they worry that at kindergarten and first grade, second grade, is when boys are just beginning to read and write. If there's negativity all the time in their imagination, that this could be inhibiting their development. And they're just advising teachers to be more tolerant and understanding. And as I mentioned before, Anthony Pellegrini, he's shown that the typical play of little boys is rough and tumble play. And there's a lot of mock fighting and sound effects, bim bam. It does not, very rarely escalates in violence. It is the happy, natural play of young males everywhere, probably in other species as well. Now, girls do it too, but a lot less. Because with little girls, there's a lot of turn-taking games and playing house, playing school, exchanging personal confidences with a best friend. So, and that kind of play is much, you know, teachers like it more. As a mother, I would prefer that. I had boys and I would have preferred to have kids playing school instead of running around. And but Pellegrini and these researchers at the University of Maine point out that we're increasingly intolerant of that kind of play, and there's a disparate impact on boys because they're healthy, natural play that helps with their socialization, and plus it's just fun. They love it. They're enjoying it. We as schools have become more risk averse and sedentary and emotion focused, they've moved away from boys. So that's the message that's got to get through. But as I said, it's hard to get schools of education to acknowledge it. I wish that they had a specialty called, a male pedagogy, and that teachers not only became aware of all of this, of the work that's done at your institute and what Richard Reeves is doing at his institute, um, that would find its way into the classroom, find its way. Do you agree with me that there's still this difficulty?
Oh,
In,
absolutely.
yeah,
Absolutely, the difficulty exists. It just keeps existing. No, you've hit the nail on the head for decades, and we so someone asked in the chat, what specific programs are you referring to that schools should implement but aren't? And I wrote back, check out GurianInstitute.com, because we have a track record of working in schools and they're working. And then I'm going to ask you, if you know of others you want to talk about. And in answer to your question, the way we think people, when they use our programs in a school, to some extent they get around having the issues because these are boys and girls learn differently programs, or the minds of boys and girls programs. So we are including everyone, right? And that's the
yeah,
way that they can use our program. It's harder for a public school, and Dr. Fletch, you weigh in on this because you were in the public schools for decades. It's harder for a public school to do okay, we're going to come in and do workshops or a 1 year program on boy friendly education, because if we're not also including girls, right? And there's an equity thing and there's laws about discrimination. So we sort of go, okay, we're going to do boys and girls learn differently. But 80 to 90% of the questions that the teachers have, the principals have, the district leaders have, where they're saying, we need you to come in and help us, 80 to 90% are about the boys.
right.
Fletch, would you agree with that? Or what would you say?
I would absolutely say that one, uh, so first I want to go back to an initial question I said in the chat, is that a lot of teacher education programs still do not teach to what boys need. Some will, though, however, through like culturally responsiveness, right? Or culturally relevant, if they're thinking about gender in a way of like being a culture. And so they will attempt to address it. It is not very clear in a lot of teacher education programs. But I do feel that what we do in GI is really good work. I just think that with a lot of teachers, what we're not addressing is our blind spot. And I think seeing not really drilling down and using the data in their own school setting, it kind of sounds like not at my school or like not at my house, right? But when we get to really look closely at what the data is showing and telling us, then we can really make a difference. But otherwise, it's kind of a blind spot. We don't really see it because the majority of our students are doing well. The majority of our students might be succeeding. There's never an all in all ways. You're always going to have the outliers, but you also have to remember that with the majority, there has to be a correlation between a lot of women educators and then our boys not doing well. To me, there's this intersectionality of like what's happening, and then that blind spot is also that other place. So I hope that answered the question.
Hmm. Yeah, and that's
You know,
kind of the
I
direction you're going, isn't it, Christina?
yes, well, you asked about what works for boys.
Hmm. Yeah.
Um, there's all the things we've read. I mean, the British, some of the things I mentioned that they were doing, and just massive efforts to improve literacy. That's reading and writing, and that's a gateway skill. If they're not good at reading, that's going to be an obstacle that will prevent them from succeeding in so many areas. And there's got to be effort on that. And so so much energy should be put in trying to find things they want to read and cater to that. But I also read a study, kind of report by Michael Reichardt and Richard Hawley, uh,
Hmm.
a recent idea that had never occurred to me, but they were able to show that if you want to be, a teacher wants to be, and this is something a teacher should know, is it turns out to be very important that the boy has a kind of a special relationship with the teacher. If it, and that's one reason to have more male teachers, but because this happens sort of naturally, but it can happen with female teachers too, is that not just the transactional, you're the student, you're learning, you're taking the test, but that you're kind of friends, that the teacher sees you outside of just, the teacher knows that you're interested in sports or knows that you're great at art or whatever you do, that she makes a connection. And they found it was just remarkable that whenever a boy can have kind of a feel like the teacher sees him, knows him, that it's apparently a huge problem for boys that just feel invisible. And I remember once watching a sort of documentary on Hispanic boys, and there was one scene that just made me want to cry. It was this young man who had dropped out, and they asked him why, and he said, "I just thought nobody wanted me there." Apparently, it's very important for a boy to know that somebody wants him there and somebody sees him, now you can imagine a teacher thinking, I've got to be best friends with everybody. It just turns out that these gestures of friendship doesn't have to be a lot, matter more. Now, doesn't it matter with girls? The thing about girls is they bad schools or indifferent teachers, but they are simply a little stronger and able to weather it better. And boys turn out to have this sensitivity. And if they feel unseen, or if they feel the teacher doesn't like them, and a lot of boys think the teacher doesn't like them. And if they think that, they're not going to work as hard. And a girl, they go to class, they want their teacher pleasers, and a lot of them, not all, but I'm talking about the average. And it's just a very different set of expectations. So that extra effort to reach out in friendliness to a boy or notice something about him can turn it around.
Beautiful. Okay, here's something. Sometimes it's difficult as an educator when, even though you may know the importance of this type of play, rough and tumble, the fear of lawsuits and liability is a concern for the school. The expectation then is to keep all of that away from the school. That
That's what
resonates for you, right?
Yes, and the schools have done that. And again, talk about disparate impact for girls. I mean, it's they like recess and running around too, but they've got a lot of other things they're going to do. The boys are going to be like caged animals. And what are they, it's so unfair. And I think most people understand this instinctively, but look, kids are still playing in playgrounds and boys are still playing, their games that can be allowed. Uh, But I think what teachers have to be told, and I wish that people were, experts and legislators and so forth were in the way that they were very attentive to the needs of girls and did strengthen girls in math and science. I don't understand why we can't have that focus on boys to strengthen them in reading and writing and to notice when something impacts them more negatively than it does the girls. Think about ways to modify it, and that would certainly be. I do think the recess thing is an example of that, of the disparate impact, and that's why you need a lobby. That's why it's important again to have your institute and all the others that people to begin to speak up and to be there. But again, it has to be inside the system. It has to be in every school district. And that's true because of the women's lobby. There's always somebody that's, or they're reading the New Yorker or these other, they're up on what's going on with the women's lobby, but they might not know about the boys. So there's this imbalance of power, and that the girls have pretty powerful, uh, you know, champions for their needs, and the boys, it's not equivalent because there are more and more groups, more and more books, more and more knowledge, but it really hasn't been applied in concrete ways inside our school districts, inside our classrooms.
Yeah, absolutely. Gordon Clay in the chat is noticing our educational system for 25 years has created, I believe, what is called in Japan a hikikomori, if I said that right, resulting in over 6 million US men without work, not interested in work, not interested in relationships. And you mentioned this about not working and then not interested in relationships, isolated in their bedrooms in their parents' home for decades. I mean, your research is showing this. My research is showing this. I actually thought the number was 9 million, but even 6 million no longer interested in work or no longer looking for work. That as you made the point, it's kind of devastating for a society,
Well,
right?
we haven't talked about the data on male loneliness and how few friends. There's so many men that don't have boys that are friendless. Now, again, think about how we broke up all male. There were places boys would form bonds on teams or in the Boy Scouts or the YMCA or clubs or even fraternities. There's been an all-out war on these male specific programs. And so now the YMCA is co-ed. The Boy Scouts are co-ed. There's still a Girl Scouts, which are all girls, but Boy Scouts have become co-ed. Um, and this even the attacks on fraternities stipulate they were bad things they did, but I think a lot of it was fueled by just an animus against all male groups, male only groups. And I think we have to rethink that because that's where on their in their sports teams or clubs, that's where boys were able to form bonds and friendships. And it's to me I'm not against fraternities because I've seen it in my own son's lives, the friends they made and they're at each other's, they'll be in one another's lives forever throughout their own, their lives. And to attack that and not to see that men, again, if you break it up, that men and boys are going to pay a higher price because of these differences. So, I mean, sometimes I think where the women's groups and gender activists have been right is sometimes when we insist there are differences between men and women that are not there. When they said, "Oh, well, men are more intelligent or have more courage," that was a myth. But I think we also do harm when we neglect genuine differences. And there are these genuine differences. There's something very specific, male bonding that goes along in all male groups. And not to see that if you break all that up, you're going to create an epidemic of isolation and loneliness. And I mean, that's not the only reason, but it contributed. It
Oh,
contributed.
absolutely contributed. And in fact, in the chat, there's a dialogue between people that's really fascinating. And toward the end of it is John Gray was talking about how much porn guys are seeing and imbibing, and it directly connects with male loneliness. A lot of reasons to look at porn, but definitely from a neural perspective, this overuse of porn connects with this loneliness, and it's just like a terrible byproduct of this loneliness and of course depression that you mentioned. um, well, are any closing remarks you want to make before we end?
I just want to end, with optimism because even though there was that sort of disparaging article in the New Yorker about Richard Reeves and Gallagher. There aren't too many. There are fewer than the past. The AAUW is not doing it anymore. Um, and I will say that when I wrote, I came out with a second edition of the War Against Boys in 2013, and the New York Times published an excerpt from it, and it's Sunday Weekend Review. It was a front page story, and that story won an award from the National Women's Political Caucus for exceptional merit in media, and that it was called Boys in the Back. That was the article I had in the New York Story. But I won this award. I think it was the only award I've ever earned since I was I was in the slide rule club in seventh grade, and I won an award in the club. um, but that organization was started by Gloria Steinem, and
Mm.
I'm not sure she was aware they were giving me the award. She might not have approved of that, but I do think there are a lot of fair-minded feminists that really care about equity, and not they're not there as just lobby, some kind of political lobby for girls. There's a lot of fair-minded women. Some of the so there are many feminists. One of my favorite parts of the War Against Boys was a chapter I wrote about feminist mothers who had sons and had to cope, and who had conventional masculinity, and they had to decide between their politics or loving their son and his accepting how he was. So I think that there's been a
Right.
lot of change, and there's a lot of goodness and openness. And I just think I just want to push that a little more in the women's movement to make it a movement about gender fairness, and that means fairness for girls and boys,
And boys.
men and women.
Thank you. And men and women. Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Sommers. Thank you, everybody. And we will leave this link and we'll come in next to hear Dr. David Geary. Christina, thank you so much.
Thank you.